some majority leader work and will be in shortly.
Oh, somebody's gonna get green paper, whoever just sent that.
And
Would you like to send it again on white paper?
That's okay.
Okay.
Okay, was there brothers?
It's green, I was gonna use it.
It's fine.
It's
Start.
I'll send the next one on
fine. I won't do anything until you're done.
Oh, man, too much information. Thanks.
Well, Sheila, why don't you come up to the comfortable seat? And we'll get started. Did you text them that we're starting?
I didn't.
Can you?
Slacking, I apologize.
I did announce it 5 minutes ago before we went.
Yeah.
Okay. And we actually do have a break scheduled in here today because of scheduling with most of the time for that. Too bad I can't leave. I've heard that 3 times. Okay, so we're gonna start, this is the exposure to radio frequency, usually known as 5G report. I don't think we asked for it. Did one of the health committees? Or did we ask for this report?
We asked for it.
We asked for it. Okay, we did. Okay, Act 79.
Act 79.
All right, so we are going to start.
So hello everyone, my name is Shayla Livingston. I am a policy advisor at the Department of Health. And what I'm going to do today is walk you through the report that we submitted to you on January 1st. And then of course take questions. If at any point I don't have an answer to your question, I will be sure to write it down and get back to you. There are many different people at the health department contributed to this report. Is that what you're looking for today?
Yes.
I want to make sure. Great.
That's good.
So the health department went through recent literature and studies and regulations in order to compile this. So I want to be very clear that we did not do any of our own research. We do not do research at the Department of Health. But we compiled the information from the scientific body of literature that exists already. The request for the report was to look into radio frequency radiation generally, and then also to look at 5G being the most recent iteration of the cellular network that will theoretically become available.
And I think we asked you to do a similar report when we were doing smart meters
Correct.
a number of years ago.
That is correct, and that is exactly what I was going to say, which is that there's even more information in the previous report. If you're looking for additional background information, we completed the smart meters white paper. It's very similar to this. Previously, I think it was about five years ago. So I'll start by saying when you're thinking about radio frequency radiation, it is a spectrum, and radio waves like that you get on your AM/FM radio are on one end, and then gamma rays are way on the other. And if you're looking at the report on page 4, you can sort of see that as you go higher from radio waves up towards gamma rays, the waves get smaller. Along that, you've got microwaves, you have infrared radiation, you have visible light, and then you have X-rays. So this is going to be important as we start to talk about the difference between 2G, 3G, and 5G. And what is interesting is as you go up the G's, the wavelengths change. So I just want to make sure everybody understands that as I begin talking. So I'm going to start out talking generally about radio frequency radiation. The only consistently proven negative health effect from radio frequency radiation is heat and heating. So much like you heat your food in a microwave using radio frequency radiation, the types of radio frequency radiation we are exposed to are much lower level, so we're not going to heat it like your food in the microwave, but it's a similar concept. And this is the people who are most at risk for this are individuals who work in the field, so they're close to transmitters, and that's what the FCC designates regulations about how close you can get and what kind of protections you need if you're going to be very close to one of these really high-powered transmitters, your skin, your tissue can actually be heated by the radio frequency and potentially burn. And so that is the only proven, well-known, well-established health implication, and that is what the FCC regulations address currently. Moving on. Cancer from RFR exposure has been extensively studied in lab and epidemiological studies, and the results from these studies do provide some evidence that RFR is associated with cancers in animals and humans, but more studies are needed, essentially, to understand how that works. So right now, there is not a known biological mechanism for how that would actually happen with 5G. And so that's a really important part of us understanding how anything would cause a cancer is having a plausible biological mechanism. And I'll get into that a little bit deeper in a few minutes. 5G wireless is different from other RFR in that it does not penetrate the human skin. So it's potentially different than 2G and 3G. And if you've read about 5G, one of the issues is that there's going to need to be more transmitters, and the reason for that is that 5G does not penetrate walls or buildings, and similarly does not penetrate the human body. So again, it's a slightly different technology. It's going to behave slightly differently.
Okay, so
in
when
terms
we
of
were
health.
looking at smart meters, the concern was the rays would penetrate into the house, into people's living space.
Mm-hmm.
5G is different than that. It won't penetrate through the walls of your house.
So 5G is different. I'm not going to say it won't penetrate the walls, but it does not do that as well.
Okay.
So 2G does that to a much greater extent, for example, than 5G would.
Okay.
But we know it does not actually penetrate human skin. So I think from the health, I'm not going to talk about the structural elements because I know
Right.
that less, but from the health perspective, this
Unlike
is the important part.
your cell phone can penetrate. I mean, that was the other, if we keep talking on our cell phones, it would cause brain cancer. This
So-
is a better,
Can't say better.
no,
It's
it's
different.
different. All right,
Yeah. Yeah.
all right.
So the Federal Communications Commission is the entity that regulates the occupational health is really where we're most concerned right now about exposure. They regulate occupational health requirements, and they just recently, actually, while we were writing this report, reaffirmed their permissible exposure limits, and that was on December 4th of 2019. So they just put out a report saying, from their perspective, from the available evidence, that their current limits are still good enough to protect human health. So I just want to put that out there for folks. So I'm going to get into a little bit more of the science and the background. Unless the committee wants, I'm going to sort of move on from thermal effects. Okay, or do you have more
Any
thermal
questions
effect
from the
questions?
committee? Okay.
All right.
Well, sorry, man.
Yeah.
Again, and I apologize for being a few minutes late. So, again, just to reiterate, there are some radio frequencies or other things on the electromagnetic spectrum that people are using today that do penetrate the skin.
Yep.
And 5G does not. Thanks very much.
So I'm moving on right now. If you're following along in the report, I'm on page 5. And I'm just going to talk a little bit more about the carcinogenic, clinical carcinogenic effects.
So we-
Um,
another question.
I'm
Oh,
sorry,
sorry,
Shane,
hold
but
on.
Senator Campion now sparks a question for me. So, if it doesn't penetrate the skin, can I assume, like, how does the technology work inside a building or a car where everybody's using their mobile phone? Does it come through the window, or what's the, clearly?
Okay, you're gonna go outside my area of expertise really quickly,
Yeah,
but
well-
all I can tell you, Senator, is I know that they need many more transmitters than, so it's a very different setup than what we are used to right now. So with
Yes.
3G and 4G, you have the towers, you have these big transmitters. And with 5G, my understanding is that there will need to
Lots of
be, it's
small
more
ones.
like wireless.
Yes.
You know, in
Yes.
my mind, I'm thinking about it more like wireless.
That much I got,
than
but
yeah.
that still doesn't solve, if it doesn't penetrate in the same way that the bigger technology does, how do we, there is a way that this technology works inside a building, clearly.
Yep,
So,
yep. I think it does, I mean, I think it does penetrate to some extent, and again, I don't wanna speak to the
okay.
Yeah, we may need, we
Physical-
can have somebody
I can
from
just tell
the
you the
industry come in and tell
person in
us.
the body, I can just tell you that part of it, I don't know exactly
All
how
right,
that
all
works.
right, thank you.
Sorry. So when you're doing, research with carcinogens, there's two very large categories, and I'm sure you all know this, but there's the laboratory studies of the animals, and then there's epidemiological studies, so, and that would be, you know, how public health normally does this type of work, is to look at the human, you know, the epi studies, so human behavior and then the human response. But there are also toxicological studies that we look at when we are examining this type of issue and exposure. So based on the available evidence from 2G and 3G wireless telecommunication RFR, it is reasonable to conclude that high levels of RFR from cell phones could be harmful to humans when they're exposed for very long periods of time for their whole life. And then also, sorry, one second. But again, those studies have not been done for 5G. So we're not sure we can translate that or tell you about 5G based on this.
Can I also assume that we haven't exposed humans to high doses of RFR for long periods of time for their whole life?
So,
I mean, it
right,
would have
so,
to be.
so you're getting to one of my points that I'm gonna make, and I'm gonna pull you all down a little bit into the appendices. So I am now on page, sorry folks. I am on page 9, bottom of page 9. So the reason that toxicological studies are so important is that no one would do that. No one would expose somebody to something that could be harmful to them for long periods of time. So when the National Toxicological Program did this work with wireless, and again, I want to clarify, it was with 2G and 3G, so it was not with 5G. They did find some evidence that it caused cancer. And it was a specific type of cancer and only for males. So if you, male,
Get off the cell phone.
no comment. Okay, so the NTP studies, when they classify their evidence, they have different categories of evidence, and they did find clear evidence of tumors in the hearts of male rats exposed to RFR. And then they found some evidence of tumors in the brains of male rats exposed to RFR. So I want to make clear that these rats were exposed for much longer periods of time and at much higher doses than most humans are exposed to. And it's not clear from these studies, since it was only the male rats, why that would be. So we still do not have this biological plausibility reason for why it would only be males or why it would actually cause these cancers. But that said, they did find this evidence, and it is important to note that. We can't.
When you say that they were exposed much more than humans, but even in places in Vermont where we struggle with cell service, you know, there are, how is that different, I guess? If you're walking around, you're not using your phone, but your phone is in your pocket, it's sort of transmitting. So can you just help us understand that? I mean, is there a difference between being on your phone and having it on your body? Or is there a difference of not even having a phone and walking down the street when there's cell towers, or what?
Sure, so let's scroll up a little bit, sorry to do this to everyone, but page 6. So we do, because there is this possibility of carcinogenic effects, there are recommendations for how you can reduce your exposure right now. And when you look at this, one really important thing to think about with radio frequency is that the distances between, the distance that it takes for something to be really intense and then to dissipate, obviously it depends on the transmitter and which transmitter that is. But if your cell phone is like pressed up against your head versus your cell phone on the table, that's actually a very important distinction for exposure. That changes depending on what we're talking about. But to your question, for a cell phone specifically, if it's on the table, my level of exposure will be much lower than if it is pressed, if I've got it, you know, like I do all the time, right? Pressed up to my ear like this, right? That's going to be a much higher level of exposure comparatively to it being literally a foot away on the table. If you are looking to reduce your own personal exposure, there are ways to do that. And obviously the main ones are to not be on the phone as much, and to have it a little bit further away from your body, to use headphones that connect to the phone, to turn off your wireless features when you're not using them, and that includes Bluetooth. And also to look at the cell phone that you have, because there are cell phones that are lower level emissions than others. So, and does that answer your question?
Kind of.
I think in terms of the levels that the rats were exposed to, no human would be exposed to that level. There's not a scenario where that's plausible, unless there was like some horrible work accident. But again, they wouldn't be exposed to it for their whole life that way.
Thank you.
Alright.
But these studies again are all on the
2G
2 and
3G.
3G, which do penetrate skin. The 5G does not. So we don't know at this point.
Correct.
It's probably too new to have done anything. Okay.
Right, and so that's one of the things that we note in the report under the 5G section, which is on page 5, is that, you know, in order to be able to tell you more, there needs to be more research on 5G specifically. Scrolling down a little bit, regulation, the report that was requested that we discuss the regulation. So again, RFR is regulated by the FCC, and they did just restate that their current levels are sufficient to protect human health. We note in our report that the 2 large bulletins that they have about biological health and health effects are fairly old and probably could use updating as well. So we link to those in case you're interested in those. That's all I have.
So, reading the executive summary, the last bullet says the FCC regulations about permissible exposure, et cetera, preempt state regulations of RFR. Does that mean if we had concerns, we'd be unable to do anything more than what the FCC is doing?
So I'm gonna look a little bit to ledge council.
The ledge council's here. Well, maybe we will have, is that, Maria, is that,
It's probably more Ellen. I can speak to it
Okay.
a little bit, but
okay.
this was something that came up
But I know
last year
that's
with
what
respect
we've
to
been
the siting
told.
and the federal
Yeah.
preemption of
Yeah,
environmental effects.
right.
That's my understanding, but that is definitely not my expertise. So I would pass that on.
I know that's what I've been told every time we've asked in here, is that this, we cannot ban it, we cannot regulate it, like, limited, I guess, limited.
There are potential types of regulation, but with respect to siting,
Okay, we can do cycle.
under Title 47, there is a specific preemption related to, that preempts the states from regulating based on the environmental effects.
And my understanding is if you try to regulate using your authority to do citing, but if the underlying purpose was a health issue, that would be preempted.
Okay.
That's my take. So it's been a while since I've looked at this,
Okay,
but I will.
but that has been
confirm.
my understanding whenever I've asked, because this is not the first time that this concern has come up. I know smart meters was the last major kind of expansion that we looked at. We were told the same thing, that we really don't have ability to stop it or limit it or do much of anything except advise people how to limit their exposure.
Mhm.
Okay, but it would seem that something that doesn't penetrate your skin, other than if you get too close, you'll get burnt, or too much, you might get burnt, is very different.
It could potentially behave
Yeah.
differently.
Yeah.
Right, I
than
don't know, we
something
don't know that for a
we don't
fact,
know, but that's,
Right.
but it is a different, we can't just say this is more,
right, we can't
Of the
extrapolate from one to the other, you got it.
okay,
That's a question.
yeah.
The evidence that you're referring to here largely refers to things like cell phone coverage, the bands that are the 3G and 4G bands. And is there any study that you're aware of that has found any adverse effect of 5G?
So in our little section on 5G, the only again, the body of literature is very small, so I wanna be clear about that. But the studies that do exist did find just that this technology does not penetrate the skin, and that the only known health effects in those studies were from excessive heating of the eyes, so the skin right around the eyes.
And were there a lot of studies that attempted to find out whether 5G represents a health risk?
No, there have not been enough studies at this point. Yeah.
Any
There have been some.
jurisdiction ban 5G?
I don't know the answer to that.
Are there different levels of 5G? I've heard like low, mid, high.
Right, so, that's a level of nuance that we're definitely not able to speak to yet. But you're right, there are different, it is not like 4G where there's just one type. There are different, there's a technical term that I'm not remembering, grades or
Do
levels.
they have different health effects potentially, or they all have the same?
We don't know. We don't
I
really
can't
know.
believe that a product can be so all around us very soon without knowing exactly what the health effects are.
There probably aren't a whole lot of studies.
We have
on
volatile chemicals.
We're in such a litigious society that you would think of
There
companies,
isn't any.
you know,
Welcome to America.
Yeah.
Yeah.
make your money and then face the
Then
lawsuits
ask.
later.
No, that's what
Medical, medical monitoring.
Right.
Watch your fire retardants in your furniture.
Yeah.
Okay, any other questions for Shayla?
It's really helpful.
It is.
Very helpful.
Sorry, we couldn't be more.
No, I think, we asked because the concern came up. I think the hard thing is, even if you came in and said, it's gonna cause everybody's head to balloon up, that there's very little we can do about it. That this is federal domain. So we're gonna,
But we are permitted, as Randy says, not for health reasons, but to regulate siting.
yes,
And the technology depends on loads more sites than
right.
on many, many
Many
more
more
sites. So that is an interesting
Mhm. And I've been,
interplay, I mean,
yeah,
Yeah, but
And
you
I've
simply
been-
can't use that as a big leaf to deal with the health issue.
right, I mean,
Yeah,
yes,
right,
yeah.
right.
But I checked this last year, because the concern was that infrastructure was going up and it could just be turned on and there would be no public input or knowledge or discussion. And when I asked I don't know if it was the Public Service Board, the Public Service Department, but when I asked, I was told, you've got something on a pole, but in order to do 5G, you need a box on the ground, and that would require a siting permit. You can't just go and say, I've got a permit to hang a 4G or a 2G up there, and I can just switch that out for 5 and it's the same. That there is actual something that needs to go and would need a public hearing, so people will be aware when something is going in. And because it needs so many, I think we've also heard that Chittenden County will probably be the one place that it will hit. It might hit some of the larger cities like Montpelier or,
So Chittenden County males.
yes, you're all in trouble. But I can sell you some prime real estate in Washington County.
About the two
Then
lots,
it's looking
right?
better and better. Maybe you covered this, I'm sorry, I was a couple minutes late, but I have traveled a little bit since we last had this conversation and noticed 5GE on it'll pop up on my phone. And I've kind of assumed that, because I think you need a new phone to use 5G, but do you have any sense of what that is? Is that just a marketing thing? Or?
I don't know.
It's always been big cities, like not
Right.
big Vermont cities, but real cities. And I'm assuming they're just getting ready. Maybe they can tell us
I think
another time.
we're creating the desire for it, so when it comes,
5G ready.
yeah, we'll be ready. Okay,
So if you have a 4G phone, you wouldn't have to worry about it.
Cheryl, does that report on my?
Only if you're a man.
okay, committee. We've got some downtime, so I've got a couple things. We never confirmed the tax commissioner. Someone asked about a background check. I did get a letter back from the tax department, and they said, as a matter of course, they do not do background checks.
Thank you for checking that.
But we did check it.
But in this case, the most people need it.
This is the governor's appointment. It is his responsibility. We
Till we
have-
approve.
We have no reason. This man has worked in Vermont in the tax department for something like 20 years, so. Before everybody leaves, Senator Campion,
Too late.
I would like to do that. The other thing, we have all the studies, and I've got 1, 2, okay, I've got 2, 3 reports that people, well, that one's got 4.
I give you one with X's.
Yeah, you got access. I think the only thing I'm seeing that has nothing on it is the last report. I'll go over these closely, which is the report on resources made available for the Vermont Enterprise Fund. I think,
Still around?
you wanted that?
No, I said, is that still around? Is there money in that fund still?
I have no idea. I don't even know what it
Is
is.
the one that's there? I won't say, I won't portray it. It was Governor Shumlin.
It rhymes with shush.
All right. So that
Thought we had
report,
no money.
That's what I thought, I know it's spent already.
I wouldn't be surprised.
Yeah, I don't
Well,
think-
maybe
I don't
we
think
should
need
find
to have
out
any more.
where that report is and find out if there's any money. And what, that sounds like it might hit your committee more than mine.